How's it going? Hey guys, how you
Uh,
doing?
good. Taking things raw.
Let's.
Has been Mr. Duncan. Oh, that's a nice addition, Alibaba.
Yeah,
I gotta write a new one too now.
That's
So
three.
sounds good.
yeah. Three, two, one, go.
So welcome to our podcast, Fitonomics, brought to you by the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics. Today we have with us Mr. Duncan Clark, who's not only an ace investor but also a fabulous author. And he's somebody who's going to offer us very unique insights into the Chinese ecosystem and their technological boom. And he's also somebody who's worked with greats like Jack Ma, and he's personally worked with him at Alibaba. He's, advised him. So it's going to be a very unique session with some great insights into these greats, China, how it's been doing, where is it heading towards. So yes, it's a very great pleasure of ours to have you on board, Mr. Duncan.
Yeah. So before diving into more deeper topics, can you please tell us about your childhood? Where did you grow up?
Well, I will. And actually, thank you for having me on the show. And also, Professor Desai was actually director of the London School of Economics when I was there. So I have fond memories. A very charismatic and very kind individual. So thank you for when I saw the name, I was like, I researched and realized he has his whole institute. So, but I'm actually British, but I grew up initially in the UK till I was 12, and then I moved to the US. So my accent tends to move across the Atlantic and back. But when I was 16, my family moved to Paris to make it even more complicated. So I didn't re-enter the British English system. I was into a French system then. So I'm all over the place. So I'm basically a British citizen, grew up in the US and France. And then after LSE, I joined Morgan Stanley in London and was an investment banker there. And they transferred me to Hong Kong after 3 years. So that started my Asia journey. And at the age of 24, I was in Hong Kong, and 25, I set up my own company, BDA. And that was 31 years ago. So I
So,
moved to
uh,
Beijing. Yeah. Hmm.
so what did you wanted to be as a kid when you were growing up? Do you always wanted to be in business investments or something else?
I have three older sisters who remind me that I wanted to hunt wolves in Russia. So I think that was when I was 6. So I think I changed. I'm not sure that's a good idea, many levels right now. But no, I didn't really want to be a banker per se. I guess I always liked gadgets. I mean, I'm just old enough that I, luckily had Apple when I was, 7th grade, the Apple IIe and so on. So it's actually interesting because I have three older sisters, and, there's 3 years between each of us. And I was probably, the last of the 4 kids, obviously, but the first to really start to get involved in bulletin boards and all that stuff, and obviously Atari and all that. So I think I was just into the sort of the tech. In fact, when I watched
I
Stranger,
think people who are always interested into tech, they're always inspired by Apple somehow. If you even look at the
yeah,
founder of Think, right? So he always says that when I was a kid, I was very intrigued by the technology that Apple delivered. So I think
yes, exactly. I think that was the first time that it started to come really into homes, right? And actually, I had the good luck to actually live in New Jersey, which people make fun of in the U.S., but actually it's a great state in terms of a very large immigrant population. But also, I was right next to Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, and Bell Labs, at the time, was became one of the storied, centers for science. I mean, there are obviously several locations in the U.S., but being around the kids. I mean, my dad wasn't, my mom wasn't an engineer, but I was surrounded by kids of engineers, and we used to do science class, which is next level stuff, and then I would volunteer at Bell Labs to do experiments, for I don't know, $5 an hour or something. So tech was, I think, the U.S. For me, New Jersey opened me up to a world of one more diverse population, thankfully, but also to technology as it was just really taking off. So I just caught that beginning of that wave, I would say.
So, just to inform our viewers, Mr. Duncan is actually also an LSE alumnus. So that's a great privilege in itself. So I just want to know something more about your experience at London School of Economics, your experience with Lord Meghnad Desai. We were unfortunately, we just joined the academy this
Too
year and we
young.
couldn't get to meet him this time.
Right.
So, we want to know about your
You've seen
interaction.
photos. He has amazing hair and amazing personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how was your experience with him? What unique insights you got there when you were at London School of Economics?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so I think the unique thing about the LSE as an undergraduate, and I think actually as a graduate student, and half the school is actually graduate, postgrad. So it's a quite a mature school in some respects. But within the undergraduate community, it's always been very international, even when I went there. And again, I was coming from Paris, so I'd already been living overseas. I like the fact that it wasn't just a very English university. There still is, the 3 Tons pub is still there in different location, but there was a bit of an English clique, and then there was everybody else, and I was in the everybody else, and I love the diversity there, and truly global. I mean, there are people from all over. And actually, my dad turned 93 years ago, so I set up a scholarship in my name and his name, running 10 years, called the Duncan and David Clark, or David and Duncan Clark Scholarship. And actually, it's mostly South Asians, or it's the Global South students. It's a full 1-year master's. I'm not involved in selecting them, but I wanted to. I hope that my dad's still here at 93, and we're hoping to go to 100. So 10 years of students, we've already had some very interesting candidates. But I love that diversity at LSE, and it's also diversity of subject. It's not just economics. It's that comes political science as well. Yeah. Please.
Just after your degree at BSc at LSE.
Yeah, I did BSc. Yeah, I did
Yeah.
directly. Yeah, and I didn't really know much about investment banking. I mean, I'd worked a summer or two, I think at NM Rothschild, which is the UK investment bank. But to be honest, I hadn't heard of Morgan Stanley very much. In Europe.
So, how was your experience working in investment banking with Morgan Stanley in late 1990s?
Right. So yeah, I joined in 1990. So at that time there were the British traditional banks like the Rothschilds and others, and there were a few Americans popping up. But the Americans were the new kids on the block, but they came in very strong. I mean, companies like obviously Goldman and Morgan Stanley back then, Lehman and others. And all I noticed is that when I was talking to the British banks versus the US banks were, they didn't hold your age against you, your youth against you. They're like, well, you'll be straight in, we're going to throw you in the pool. At that time, even sounds crazy today, but the British banks were like, well, you'll share a computer with 3 other people and you have to ask to get out sort of, files. And the Americans said, well, here's your computer, here's your assistant. They kind of lied. They said we have a secretary. I mean, we all shared it, but you had a business card. People call your number, and they would answer Duncan Clark's office. I was 21. I thought this was great, but anyway, they really did invest a lot in young people. They got their pound of flesh, I will say, but they paid well and they worked you very hard. And I liked the American approach of just get on with it. They wouldn't hold your lack of experience against you. In fact, they wanted you to come in and just work as hard as you could. And the British system at that point was still a little bit who you know and all that. And so for raw experience, there was nothing like the American banks. And as a result, the Americans did very well. What's that?
What was the role at Morgan Stanley?
So the first year I was in, we all went to New York. So firstly, they flew us to New York. We were only 24 people from Europe at that point out of maybe 150, 130 globally. So the Americans were already, in New York living there. We show up for like a month living in this nice hotel. They immediately resented us. That was fun. And we would hang out with our Japanese and other colleagues. But my job after that month was I was put in the real estate finance department, which wasn't my top choice, but I actually learned a lot about real estate finance. I didn't know that I needed to know, and it's been very useful. But after a year, I was able to switch to tech. At that time, it's called Telecom and Technology Group. Again, we were 2 people, can you imagine, in Europe covering this stuff. I mean, now it's hundreds, right? So I was able to capture another wave here, which was, the telecom deregulation wave. So we had like the, BT had been privatized and this kind of stuff. So basically across Europe, there was a beginning of a wave of a private sector getting into telecom services. And then that was beginning to boost, tech firms like Ericsson and Siemens. We had the privatization wave in Eastern Europe as well was happening around then. This is after the wall had fallen now. So basically, I managed to capture a bit of a telecom wave, and then wanted to move to Tokyo, where I'd been when I was 18, because my sister lived there. But Japan was beginning its long, kind of 30-year sluggish, period. So I ended up in Hong Kong.
With the Morgan Stanley, and you transferred to Hong Kong. So what led your focus towards China? Like we see a lot of interest from you
Right.
to China.
Right.
How's that?
Well, the link was a little bit because we've been doing privatization work in Europe, Morgan Stanley for governments and stuff, and then there was a trend in Asia to think about, okay, what are we going to do with our telecom sector? And interestingly, when you look back at Asia at that period, it was divided into two. It was Japan and non-Japan Asia, they called it. Japan was very mature, established, and then you had the rest. And the rest, China was almost, rounding error, because it was more about, the tigers at that point, Singapore, Korea, a bit of Malaysia, there was semiconductor manufacturing in Malaysia, and Philippines, etc. So China was a complete blank spot. So initially I worked on things in Indonesia and Singapore, Malaysia, etc. But during the course of a year, I ended up going to Beijing, and people started asking the question, like, what's going to happen with China with telecommunications and technology? There were, I think, 5,000 mobile phones in the country at that point. So they would cost, $5,000. They were these huge. They called them the Gorbachev or the Dagada. They were massive. We knew that China couldn't stay so backward for so long, and you met very smart people in China, but it was obviously coming off the back of, Tiananmen Square had happened a few years earlier, but there began to be investment coming into the country. There'd been some investment in the manufacturing of China in the 80s. But nobody really thought of it as a market. But that started to change. And so I left Morgan Stanley, set up my company BDA with the backing of Morgan Stanley to help figure out how Western companies could come into China and participate in what we thought would be a growth, but we had no idea it was a massive explosion of telecom and technology in the country.
So as you said, it's a very important, at a point where there was, numbered phones there, to a point where, there have been companies like Alibaba. So, you have been one of the few individuals who has had the opportunity to closely observe Alibaba grow into this, e-commerce giant that it is, right?
Sure.
So what attracted you towards Alibaba in the first place? And, what made it different? And lastly, how did you help the company grow? Because you have had personally advised Jack Ma.
Yeah, I did. So, firstly, the city of Hangzhou, where Alibaba was born, actually had some telecom links. There was a company called UT Starcom, which also had a SoftBank connection. So I was familiar a little bit with that city, but at that time it was, 2-3 hour train ride from Shanghai to get there. Now it's like 50 minutes on a high-speed train. But Hangzhou itself was a little bit off the map. The reason that I discovered Alibaba, actually a colleague and I wrote a column in the South China Morning Post about tech developments in China. And we started to hear a little bit about this guy, Jack Ma, in 99, I think. Even before he'd had a little bit of publicity, because Alibaba was his third tech venture, actually. The first he had done, I think 95, was like, first he had a little translation business in his hometown. The guy was an English teacher, as you know, right? I mean, he was not a tech guy. He doesn't have a tech background. But he got into like translation. He was always focused on merchants, small companies, how he could help them. Initially was translation, literally helping local companies translate into English their catalogs. And then he got a little bit, he had a trip to the US, and I wrote about this in the book over my shoulder, and I'm going to talk about a new book coming out later. But basically that was the origin story of Alibaba, was connecting these small merchants to the internet. Even when the internet wasn't available in his hometown, he was telling people, look, I can connect you. You can't see it, but trust me, I'm going to, put you on the internet. They didn't know what the internet was. So it was really the force of his personality that had helped bring a team with him to Alibaba. So when he founded the company in 99, I think there were 18 co-founders. Most of those people had worked with him in the previous venture or two that he'd already established. The second venture he had was called China Yellow Pages, or China Pages, which basically was a Yellow Pages online, but it kind of got crushed by local government. So he was a bit late to the internet party. The internet, I started getting involved in China. I first logged on, I think in 95, was like dial-up internet. Then there were some internet entrepreneurs founding companies like Sohu, Sina, and a company called NetEase, who I worked with the founder there. But Alibaba was late, to the internet party. But Jack had kind of been involved, but he didn't really have a business until 99 of his own that was stable. And that was the one that I met him in his apartment in Hangzhou.
So, your interactions with him, what kind of advice did you give? Where did you see, that this company has a massive potential and, I can take it forward? What kind of advice, what kind of conversations you had?
To be honest, I told him at the time, like, I knew that he had potential. He's still an incredibly funny person. He's very intelligent. He's very clever. but he's also very self-deprecating, which at the time was very rare in China. He would constantly make fun of himself. He would say, I don't have any connections. I have a mom and dad who were, in government. I mean, he didn't go to Harvard, so he made a virtue of his ignorance and his lack of status. And that was attractive because a lot of other people at the time were talking about, well, when I came back from Harvard and Stanford and all this kind of stuff, or my dad's in the government. I mean, he went the opposite approach. So my initial impression was for him personally, I felt this guy is going places. The company, Alibaba.com, which is still there. If you log on Alibaba.com today, it takes you to their B2B site, so business to business e-commerce. The vision is and was that companies will conduct business online. Now, certainly they could find each other online, but whether they would actually transact online, it turned out, that it's still a tiny percentage of Alibaba's business today, because this was before he got into business to consumer, right? And that the whole takeoff really came from consumer e-commerce. So to be honest, early on, and I wasn't the only one, some people were questioning, well, is this business really the right one? But everybody, I think, who met him, fell into his spell to some extent. That he was very funny, charming, and you just felt he was going places. And so I told him, I would invest in you personally. The company, I'm not sure at this point. And stupidly, I didn't buy the shares, the options that I was given. That's another sad story. But Alibaba had some tough times after '99. We had the .com crash.
I think that costed you $35 million, right?
I don't want to look anymore. Actually, recently, when it crashed again, I was losing less money. But anyway, never look back at your mistakes. So you want to make your mistakes in life small and early. This was not that small, but it was early. But I think in the end of the day, he's the great survivor. He and the company have changed multiple times, and actually they survived the .com crash partly because they raised a lot of money. They raised, initially from Goldman Sachs, from a friend of mine, Shirley Lin, who left Morgan Stanley, went to Goldman. Goldman owned 50% of the company. They bought for like $5 million. And then they sold it later for, pennies, but they could have made a lot of money as well. But also SoftBank. So the role of Masayoshi's son, who invested crucially before the .com crash in Alibaba, they allowed Jack to survive and then later thrive from about 2003 with the launch of Taobao, their consumer e-commerce. Anyway, so Alibaba is a story of, it's a very unlikely story of survival, but it's Jack's ability to charm people, raise money, that allowed him to have the dry powder, if you will, to survive the downturns.
Right. So as you said, for a very long time, Jack Ma was actually the face of modern China. For a lot of people, youngsters like us, we knew Jack Ma was somewhat equivalent to China for us, right? So he was an ultimate success story. But recently we've seen a massive shift, what some call the Icarus movement, where he flew too close to the sun, right?
Yes.
So was his stepping back inevitable given the political climate, or was the Ant Group IPO suspension a specific punishment for his outspokenness?
Right. So to his credit, I mean, Jack had already himself relinquished a number of titles. So he'd stepped down earlier as CEO and even as chairman of the company. And again, because he is not an engineer, he always talked about the need to bring in, talent, be it financial talent like Desai, who, is now chairman of the company, but also, engineers. He always prided himself on bringing in people from earlier on from like GE or, he knew his own weaknesses in terms of technical knowledge, international stuff. But again, his key asset was the ability to motivate people in the company and also to deal with the outside world in terms of investors. But on government, it became more complicated. Foreign governments loved him. In fact, for years, many Western heads of state or princes and presidents would come to Hangzhou and want to meet Jack, in his office. That you bump into them at the Starbucks in, in Alibaba headquarters. Like, isn't that Princess of Sweden? Yep. Because, he had such charisma. But that actually started to irritate the Chinese government a little bit, because, in China, any city you go to or town, the most important person in that town is actually the party secretary. It's not even the governor or the mayor. And, the Communist Party, obviously, there's a superstructure of control in China from the Communist Party. And when foreign government officials and executives would say, well, we'll skip the government, let's talk to Jack, because Jack was so accessible, so funny. Of course, he spoke English. He was in Davos. So there was a little bit of jealousy building over the years, to be honest. And you could see this actually even in Davos itself, where you'd had, after Xi Jinping came to power, appearing there, but Jack would also be there. So eventually, to answer your question, though, there was some people had it in for him for some time, either because what he represented as the private sector. There is a sense that the state and the party needs to retain control, or him personally. He could be very frank, and in fact, his frankness really came to a head in October 2020 when he criticized directly former and actual government regulators sitting in front of him in this summit in Shanghai, saying, you guys know how to run the canal system, but we're the airplanes, in terms of technology and finance, etc. So, but it wasn't a new thing. I mean, Jack had there, and I describe in the book, actually, there had been some run-ins with the government over the years and other companies. Famously, he humiliated eBay, but when he started stepping on the toes of Chinese banks and Chinese officials, it was getting a little bit risky for him. But I didn't expect this level of crackdown. But I did, name the last chapter Icon or Icarus because I was writing in this book first came out in 2016. The market capitalization of the company, was growing. The company had gone public in 2014 as the largest IPO in history, right? So you kind of, when you're writing about something very successful, you don't want, a book is a tough thing to write because you don't know in 18 months or 2 years what's going to happen. So I did hedge my bets, but that Icarus moment did really come into gear in October 2020. And of course, in the midst of COVID, and it's a whole other phase for the Chinese economy. So he definitely had some enemies, but he had many, many fans and almost a cult-like following in China amongst aspiring entrepreneurs, but around the world. I mean, the book came out in 36 languages, including places which, he didn't look like me. He's like a non-white dude, running a globally impactful company. And, Alibaba's in many countries, right? Even 10 years ago through AliExpress and Lazada in Southeast Asia. So the company is something accessible internationally, and he is a very accessible figure because he's almost the American dream kind of made in China, right? Rags to riches. Anyway, but that, what is the government's attitude to people like that in China? Well, we saw it's not 100%, you can do whatever you want.
So, looking back at the Jack Ma era of the Chinese tech, do you think that we will ever see a Chinese entrepreneur with that level of global rock star?
Probably a robot. I don't know if one individual, one humanoid can have that level of impact again. I mean, one, because, the lesson of the Jack's experience is, you've seen it with others, from ByteDance to obviously Pony Ma from Tencent, another very impactful company, always kept a very low profile. But since the crackdown started on him in October 2020, like people at like Zhang Yiming at ByteDance, like you've seen other entrepreneurs actually give up titles or even give up equity to kind of lower their own profile. There's a sense that the tallest tree can be felled the first. This exists in many cultures. But yeah, I don't know if there's one. Also, I think Jack Ma was there at the right time at the right place. I mean, he had this, his community really at the core is these merchants. And if you go to Zhejiang province again, and I know Reliance and other companies are in Hangzhou and so on. It's a very tech savvy place, but it's in the heartland of Chinese, manufacturing and trading. Obviously, you've got Guangdong province, but also this Zhejiang province is where 90% of the world's goods are traded. This is one city called Yiwu that I write about. So you have tons and tons of trade happening in this one city, which affects the world. And Jack arrived with this, basically evangelizing this new technology could help these merchants. And so that was a pretty, potent cocktail. I don't know if there's any, I mean, I'm sure there'll be other things happening in the future, a new technology shift, again, maybe it's robotics or quantum or something, but you need a big shift to have an opportunity for somebody else to make that big a difference. He just happened to be there at the right time.
What about BYD? Like BYD is making great strides in EVs right now. So
Correct.
Do you think it can come anywhere close?
BYD has a major impact. I mean, it is, again, it's not a new company. And famously, also, it's had investment for a long time and no longer from Warren Buffett, right? So it's the product of, decades of investments and planning and grit from the founders, for sure. But again, you don't hear as much talk about the founder there. In fact, you hear a little bit about Stella, who's actually married to the founder, but she doesn't talk about it. But I think if anything, the story of BYD, I mean, Mexico this morning just announced they're going to slap 50% tariffs on Chinese imports into Mexico. BYD is an incredible company, but it's vertically integrated. You've seen the shipping fleet that they have. It has, I think, more of a, even if it doesn't want to be, it could be seen as a bit of a threat in terms of the sheer scale of it and the advances that it has, along with other companies like CATL on lithium batteries. It's seen almost at the vanguard of this massive wave of Chinese exports. We saw China now having a trade surplus of $1 trillion US. I think Alibaba was different in the sense it was more of a domestic company initially. It did, it has some international elements, but I think it was a homegrown hero in China.
I think
BYD
is
less so.
nowadays a part of starting a company in China. You're seeing companies like Pinduoduo doing a great job with its product like Timo in the US.
Yes.
Right? But we don't know a lot about that company.
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, they were building on the coattails, if you will, of Alibaba. I mean, PDD, for example, was smart and able to, outplay Alibaba in, say, rural areas of China, where Alibaba kind of took its eye off the ball a little bit. And Alibaba became quite a complex organization, obviously with cloud, obviously the financial stuff we mentioned with Ant. It was, and even it had this restructuring after, Jack kind of climbed down. Very complicated, like many different business units, and PDD was one of the companies that was benefiting. Also, even TikTok under ByteDance, the Douyin started getting into e-commerce. So Alibaba started to lose market share to companies like PDD, also JD.com, and actually for years there was this judgment from some investors on Alibaba's. You're basically buying into a dominant player that is losing market share in e-commerce. In consumer e-commerce, and this was effectively the market that Alibaba had invented, but it was seen as beginning to lose its touch. And actually, what's very interesting in the last few years is that Alibaba has reinvented itself with AI, and my next book is called AI Baba because it's embracing AI. And some people say there's MAGA here. It's make Alibaba great again. Is AI because. Yeah. But so anyway, if you go back 3-4 years ago, people say, Alibaba's losing, from a very high market share, 2/3 of the market, down, with companies like PDD and others. But now it's a completely different equation because of its massive investments in cloud and then its AI future, which is, as you know, I mean, Alibaba now with Qwen is like the #1 open source LLM company in the world. Okay, it's open source, but still it's having massive influence. So I think we've seen. There's a reason for me to write a new book, an update, because more than an update, there's a lot happening in China's place in the world, but also Alibaba has completely changed. And Jack Ma famously, it was in February this year, after Chinese New Year, President and Chief Communist Party Secretary Xi Jinping shook his hand in public in a gathering of entrepreneurs. Yeah. That was very symbolic because Jack Ma is not the chairman of Alibaba. He's retired officially. He has his shares and his foundation, but his name was called out by President Xi. He shook the hand, along with many other entrepreneurs, signaling that he's come back from the cold after almost a 4-year absence. So that was important because China is signaling that it is going to work with its entrepreneurs. And again, this was just weeks after second-term President Trump inauguration, with all of the entrepreneurs around him, including a number of Indian Americans as well. But actually, it was the contrast between having a crackdown on entrepreneurs and then Trump basically, his family was sitting amongst, the big tech guys in the US. I think China realized also with a sluggish economy, you need to nourish entrepreneurship, but it definitely will have some guardrails, perhaps unlike the US, where you feel like the tech bros are kind of running the country right now. The Communist Party of China has made it very clear. They run the country, but they're also engineers. And so our friend Dan Wong's book called Breakneck talks about this. Like, America's run by lawyers, but actually, or was maybe now by tech guys, but China's run by engineers. And the Communist Party understands the power of science, technology, and they want to control the genie in the bottle. But they know they need to give a bit of oxygen because the last few years, and here I'm sitting in Beijing, the economy's been pretty weak. The zero COVID crackdown, the crackdown on Jack and others, but also we have a terrible property crash in this country. Most people's wealth in China is tied up in their homes. So there's a bit of a bad mood here right now, a lot of people. And then it's hard to encourage young people to find, also when they can't find jobs. So China's economy is a split screen. I mean, right now I say split screen. I see you guys on the left and me on the right. That's how I look at the Chinese economy right now. We see the, very fancy tech, shiny objects. You mentioned BYD, but we could go on into robotics. We could go on, Alibaba itself and so on. But on the other side, we see a difficult economy, which is struggling to regain its pre-COVID vibrancy.
Since China has been, taking a slight backseat, because it's struggling internally, the domestic consumption is going down,
Yes.
Domestic investments are going down. So can you think that this China model can be copy pasted or, used directly by the Southeast Asian countries when you look at Vietnam or Indonesia today? So do you see that they have the same hunger or the capability and the, conditions and incentives to kind of do what China did in the late 90s?
Well, one, China's still here. So, even if you talk about Vietnam and outsourcing, and because of the US, the complications of the US-China tech trade war, Vietnam cannot, for example, independently operate, without, Vietnam and ASEAN are trying to play a delicate game, really, like balancing, inbound investments from China, trade with China, but also, for chips, for example, still be able to access, the top NVIDIA chips. And, so there's a very complicated game. So China's still here. So, and replacing China, if one wanted to, well, it would take decades, as we've experienced, given the centrality of China to supply chains and manufacturing. I mean, any device, I don't know what you've got to hand, but I mean, these are made in Shenzhen. It's kind of hard to imagine a world without China. But of course, what we learned with zero COVID, with just in case as well as just in time, and plus the political tensions, people are going to be investing in having more diverse supply chains. But China is the excellent a player par excellence in supply chains, even in Vietnam, or even in India, right? We've seen even the restrictions, I think, on Chinese coming to India, partly from the Chinese side, because China doesn't necessarily want to share all of the talent and expertise that Flextronics, Foxconn, all these guys have. But Southeast Asia is important. I mean, I just came back from there. I'm opening an office in Singapore actually next month for my company BDA. It's in a great place between China and India, and a massive market, but it is a fragmented market in Southeast Asia. I mean, not to mention this tragic conflict we have between Thailand and Cambodia. Things can break out, but more than that, it's more like logistics, language, a bit not as bad as the EU in terms of that fragmentation, but it is, it's easy to say it's one block when it really isn't. There's a lot of investments that needs to happen, and a lot of that investment's coming from China, in terms of connectivity in rail and all the rest. So anyway, but I think countries like Singapore, I think, are very well positioned because they're investing, a very smart government investing, even looking now at nuclear, et cetera, for data centers and so on. So I think Southeast Asia is a very important bucket. But if you put it all together, it's almost like Guangdong province in China. It's China is of the next level of size, as is India. So I think perhaps the bigger question is also, where are we heading on India? And now with the rise of the GCCs and new opportunities coming to India, but also because of challenges with the US or the US's own challenges with itself, let's say. I think India is going to be enjoying a lot of new opportunities.
So you have worked very closely with Chinese entrepreneurs and their workforce. So how they are different from the rest of the world?
And just add to this, you just talked about India, where it is headed next, and how powerful it can become. So how does the Chinese workforce and the Chinese ecosystem compare with that of India? What makes them different? Is it the education? Is it the upskilling? What is there a concrete metric that India can use to kind of figure out where it is and where it can head, and where China differs from it?
Well, it's interesting. I think, firstly, there are lessons to be learned from China, but I think be very careful to take a Chinese plant and try to plant it in Indian soil. My company BDA, we had BDA India actually in Delhi. So from around 2004 to 2009, we were working with TRAI and the World Bank, and then Indian and Western clients, learning from the Chinese model. But it's so different in some respects. I mean, I think the ambition is the same, right? I mean, the scale, obviously, India is now surpassed the Chinese population. It's also critically a much younger population now. So it has, on the plus side, India has some real pluses now, actually, that it didn't necessarily have as by comparison 10 years ago. But China's done an amazing job on infrastructure, right? I mean, the reason I first moved here initially was because of the investments happening in telecom, hardware, fixed line and then mobile and all this kind of stuff. But these massive investments made primarily by state companies, but using Western vendors, and later, ZTE and Huawei, meant that China was ready, to absorb and to create a domestic market of scale. And I know a lot has been happening in India recently. I just saw it when I saw you in Mumbai. So a lot has changed. But I think China was first to really build the base of the pyramid there in infrastructure, then the sort of telecom service providers, and ultimately build up into content and e-commerce. And then the pyramid flips, because the pyramid, once you built enough infrastructure, you create the massive value at the application layer, at the stack there. And so I think, now India, we're seeing the same thing, getting beyond the constraints, the physical constraints. Even the innovations that have happened in India in terms of payments or ID cards and such, all this stuff contributes to this sustained growth. So I think China's policy has been, it is state planned, and we often tend to think of state planning as very inefficient, bureaucratic, corrupt, and there's some of that also. But a lot of the people making the plans are educated to some of the top universities in the world. The Central Party School of the Communist Party, by the way, they have free unrestricted internet. They don't restrict the internet to themselves. That's just because they want to know the best, and they have visiting, top scholars. So they've learned about how to be, to plan from a macroeconomic standpoint. But on the company level, the Chinese entrepreneurs are incredibly dynamic, incredibly hardworking. The cliche is it's 996, 9 they say in Chinese, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. But people have updated that, say, that doesn't really catch it. People are working 007, right? Midnight to midnight, 7 days a week. And certainly life in China is constantly lived on the mobile phone, as it is in India, I know, but there's no real clear line between your family life and business. It's around the clock. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, people don't sit back and wait for things, from the government. In fact, Xi Jinping famously doesn't want to create a culture of dependency on social welfare, etc. He wants people to hustle. Some have criticized him, saying a little bit callous, but I mean, China is not engaging, perhaps wrongly. It's not boosting its domestic consumption or pro-consumption pleasure. It's more relying on massive production, innovation, technology. This will be the solution, they feel. And it's, by the way, it's having some challenges, right? Because China's become such a powerhouse in exporting, as you mentioned, EVs, but we can go through the list, photovoltaic cells, et cetera, that becomes a threat. But domestically, people hustle here. The young generation, though, are beginning to ask questions about, can I even, have the lifestyle of my parents? Also, we've seen a property crash, which has meant maybe, their parents would have left the money, maybe they don't now, or their parents were rural areas, they never got on the property ladder. There's just a lot of social challenges, by the way, that's global, I think, for your generation, right? We're facing a lot of challenges with the environment and so on. But I think the entrepreneurial culture in China is extremely strong. And it never got killed, let's say, by communism. I mean, yes, China had communism from 1949, but, it wasn't like the Soviet style, I mean, I'm sure there are great Russian entrepreneurs in 1912, whatever, but, in China, and I describe it in my book, in the Alibaba book, just how quickly, capitalism really flourished again, even in the late 70s, just the edge of the Cultural Revolution. So Chinese are very entrepreneurial people, very hardworking, very aspirational. Somewhat actually, the challenges with America is that America also sees itself as a very, capitalistic entrepreneurial place, and that's true. But there's sort of a mirror kind of challenge going between the two countries, and I think now with India, it's a very interesting dynamic. Also, how much does the States work with India as well? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. Actually, we wanted to even talk to you about this. So in the last 2 years, there has been a massive capital outflow, from India. So my question is, and it has further been aggravated, obviously, by the US tariffs. Yeah, outflow.
Right. Okay.
So, is it a statement about India's startup and the perception of people about that ecosystem, or is it something that's largely driven by external factors?
Well, maybe describe a bit the outflow. You're seeing outflow from India, you said.
Yeah. So it's so the FIIs have been reducing significantly over the last 2 years.
Right.
So is it a statement about people's perception about Indian ecosystem and the value it's creating, or is it because of largely external factors like maybe the US tariffs or the Fed rates that they've been adjusting, or some opportunities in the other places? What do you think it is?
Well, I think we see it a little bit with China. Obviously, there's been, it's much more targeted, sanctions and entity lists on Chinese technology companies, but, which has meant that there's been less investment in China, a big drop in investment. That was really my advisory business luckily we do more than China, but the China bit was hit very hard. but also it's just the sheer vibrancy of the US economy, right? And then, in this AI, and as we know, if you strip out the Magnificent Seven in the US, it's not like the US economy is in perfect shape, right? We talk about a K-shaped economy in terms of, challenges for middle and lower end consumers or the future of the middle class, and almost this excessive fascination with, the Nvidias and then some of the non-public ones as well, like OpenAI and so on, like this almost bubble that has been building, certainly the upper end. So I think, had you not been investing in the US the last few years, certainly until the last few months, you would have been punished, right, as a fund manager and so on. So the sheer vibrancy of the US economic machine, I think, is one thing. I don't think that necessarily condemns, a view of India. It's just more that's happened around the world. It's just, capital has been beating a path to the US and has been rewarded for that. But the bigger question now is, is that sustainable? I mean, the valuations that we see of some of the U.S. companies, even after a slight downturn, are still extremely high versus, say, for example, some Chinese tech companies. And now we're seeing Chinese firms going public. We just saw one called Moore's Thread that had a massive IPO in Shanghai. It's basically substituting Nvidia or other elements of Nvidia's business. And there's a patriotic play to back this. I'm sure will happen in India as well. But at the end of the day, it's the U.S. companies have that global reach, that edge for now. The bigger question is, can the U.S. retain its edge by, this very capital-intensive AI model versus, workarounds that the rest of the world's going to have to do, either because they don't have the capital or, in China's case, the chips, but they have talent. And I think the key message here is that China and India are major providers of a global good, which is people like you, no pressure, but young, talented people, by the way, coming in shorter supply, in parts of the world, including in China. And so whoever is able to tap, this fire of entrepreneurial, hardworking, intelligent, well-educated people, that's going to be, who's going to win. And that may include, will China itself be able to tap fully its own next generation talent? That's a question, and the same within India. So, yeah.
Talking about the tech and the innovation, right? So we have data on World Intellectual Property Organization. Now we are seeing that half of the IPs, which is intellectual properties, are being filed by Chinese people.
Yep.
Right. So in your view, has China generally crossed the threshold of from the tag copycat to innovators? Or is there a lot of junk IPs being filed?
Yeah, there's junk IP too. Yeah, so I think just purely looking at filings is not the best. It's what you need to look at is if they're being used, right? If they're being licensed, if they're generating value. And so, we often get these headlines. And yes, there are some, robotic filings and junk, local government backed BS kind of filings. But there's also real stuff happening there. If you look at, say, the fight against cancer, I think 50% of the scientists named in papers, are mainland Chinese, not even ethnically Chinese. So you can't really win in climate tech or fight against cancer or some of the other big issues in the world without Chinese talent or without Indian talent. It's just good luck, right? I mean, but the question is, where are those people going to be? That's interesting. Are they doing it in China, or are they doing it in India, or are they doing it in the US or elsewhere? But as I said, it's kind of a global good. Whoever can attract and retain those people and create the conditions, for innovation to occur, and that's. It's like comedy. It's hard to define, right? It's not. It doesn't happen overnight. You can't just script a joke and everybody laughs, right? It's so creating conditions for people to innovate and thrive on innovation. That's the secret sauce that everybody's looking at now. And so, the right kind of culture.
Do you think India is moving in the right direction where it can kind of, make the most use of its demographic advantage at this point, or we're far away from that?
No, I think it's happening. I mean, obviously the US is perhaps helping with kind of crazy and unpredictable visa policies, and not just that, but also, are they going to continue sustaining investments in, deep science, right? In the United States, long-term, 10, 20, 30-year funding, that's been the success, the secret sauce for the success in the United States, right? Is both that investment and the openness to talent. So if they stop messing with that, I mean, that's their story. But then the question is there, what's happening? Will talent no longer, top talent go to the United States? I think top talent will still go to the United States for many reasons, but maybe there'll be some coming back, or there'll be some others who decide to work from India, maybe part of the time, or if you don't want to move your whole family to US, I mean, totally understandably right now with the the unpredictability of the visa stuff, then we're going to be seeing some sort of blend of this. What does it mean to be Indian versus American Indian, the same with Chinese. And with Chinese, it's more difficult because there are specific sanctions applied to specific companies, even specific universities in China. If you attended those, you won't be able to get visas in the United States. We haven't seen that with India. And in fact, if anything, if the US is smart, well, if it's going to pursue this tougher policy in China, it's going to really need to work closer with India. So yeah, I think we'll see how this plays out. But in terms of already we see China's pulling ahead in certain areas. We mentioned obviously EVs, solar panels, which is a bad example because they've kind of crashed the value of these things. But biotech, when you just have, it's not just about the people and the infrastructure, it's also some of the regulations, some of even the data sharing. I mean, China's has massive amounts of data that is being accessed by companies. There's less perhaps of a GDPR obsession that we see in Europe, which has been holding them back. So yeah, there's different elements to this, but there's a general sense that in the future China is a lab today. China is kind of the future. You can get glimpses of the future here. Now, whether this will all have to replicate this or license it or be influenced by it, I think it's more will be influenced by it. But you need to understand what's happening in this lab today in China.
And right now, how are the entrepreneurs looking at the manufacturing opportunities in China?
Yeah, well, so with robotics, and as you already know, right here near here in Beijing, you have like Xiaomi can spit out I forget how many cars a minute, but also phones a phone a second. So some of these factories are completely dark. There's very few or no human beings in there. So automation. It's a big question. The US is talking about now doubling down on robotics, but will it create jobs for the base and sort of the voters? It's probably not very clear. So I think, but China is streets ahead, I would say, in terms of certainly Shenzhen. If you look at the hardware ecosystem in Shenzhen, it's not just the sheer size of a factory. It's the interconnectedness of different component suppliers and this element of co-opetition, right? If you need something, you're going to find something going to help you out with it today versus waiting 3 weeks for it to be shipped with FedEx or some taxes applied or tariffs. It's just unbelievable, right? If you go to Shenzhen and you feel this hardware, this thriving like beehive of activity. And so can we replicate this or do we somehow, reduce our reliance or dependency on that? But, this is the big question now as we move into new industries and advanced manufacturing.
Yeah, in fact, as you already said, we were talking about chips, right? So just recently, I think 2 days back, President Trump has, authorized NVIDIA to ship the H200 chips to China, provided that they pay a 25% tax to the government, right? So this is a massive shift from the total blockade strategy. So do you think this is gonna, incentivize China to produce even more and then dump it to other economies? What is the US thought process behind this? What do you think the government has? What is its thought process behind making this shift, allowing this export to happen?
Well, part of it's lobbying, right? It's Jensen and others who make the case that unless the U.S. is able to export to around the world, including to this large market of China, then they can't retain their global leadership. But then you have other voices, right, in the defense area saying either it's dual use or even high level chips, Blackwell chips, if that's in the hand of the Chinese military, this is something that's eventually existential for the United States. So I don't think there's one voice, and it's a complex situation. But I think for now, in the last weeks or so, we see particularly after Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping in Korea, this sense of a bit of a pause. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, but the cost to both sides actually of continued friction, but particularly the United States over rare earths. When China basically, made it very clear, that they have leverage, and it does seem like the U.S. blinked in this case. Don't forget the U.S. is thinking, 6-12 months out to the midterm elections. There's a big issue in the United States right now about affordability, jobs, etc. So the Chinese know how to play this against them. I would say that China also has concerns about its own economy, but it's not a democracy, right? So it's able to handle this in different ways. We've seen that doubling down on exports and manufacturing seems to be the response there, rather than like helping consumers. There have been some moves to do that, but China doesn't feel like it has the same dependency on domestic concerns that the US does.
So if we look at the foreign direct investments of India and China both, right? We don't see a much difference, right?
India or in divestments? Or?
Yeah, for institutional investments,
Okay.
right? India stands at like $98 billion and China stands at 110, around
Right.
110, right? So it seems that the biggest venture capital in China, it's the Chinese government.
That is now the case. I mean, that wasn't the case before. In fact, and famously the Alibaba story. I mean, the fact that Goldman was an early investor. I mean, China had to kind of depend on, particularly U.S. VCs, because they were able to invest in loss-making companies. And it's only in recent years that we started to see the Chinese stock markets allow companies that are losing
Right.
money to go public, right? That was a big change that was made. So the fact I mentioned this company Moore's Thread, which just went public in Shanghai and had this 5,000% appreciation. I mean, they've lost $1 billion in the last 3 years on heavy R&D, and they're on the sanctions list of the United States, because now there's a sense that the U.S. is effectively fostering a national team approach in China by making it very difficult for some companies who are leaders in their fields, including Huawei famously, to sell overseas. They're forcing effectively companies to band together, work together. Interestingly, even the chairman of Huawei the other day said, we still want American competition. It makes us stronger. So there is, it's a complex issue because even with the NVIDIA case, I mean, we see now the Chinese government saying, well, do we want to allow them to sell? Even though the U.S. is allowing them to export, do we want to be dependent on U.S. tech here? And in fact, how do we develop our own base? So it's a very complicated issue. I mean, I don't think consumers are that patriotic. If you're trying to generate tokens in AI, you want the NVIDIA, right? Sorry.
So what is a global investor's perspective on the China and on India?
So like, how is it, how does it stand in comparison, India versus China?
So to be honest, it's not the same category because previously, because China had so much more investment, both multinationals, as I described. When I first came here, there was already there was a large increase in China entering the WTO and so on, but also portfolio investments. Right, we saw Alibaba, Tencent, others, massively backed by U.S. PE, but also hedge funds. But then, the crackdown in 2020 on Jack, and it wasn't just him. There were a lot of companies that were cracked down on that did a lot of damage to investors, right? I mean, there was a whole education training sector that was basically wiped out overnight when the government said, well, we don't want, Chinese children, spending all this money on, English language education through the private sector, et cetera. So that destroyed, collectively several $1 billion, right, of market value was evaporated effectively. And then we had the zero COVID policy, which really slowed the economy. So investors who were massively invested in China before, many have left. And many, we even had this debate about, is China even investable? Now, of course, it still is, and multinationals are still here, but they're investing in new ways. I mean, Volkswagen is investing because it needs to learn about EVs to save itself back in Germany. They're no longer making money that they can ship back out to subsidize, all plants in Germany. So things have changed for multinationals, but also for portfolio investors. There's some people now coming back in the market in Hong Kong, but don't forget, we have these sanctions lists that are very unpredictable. We have government policy in China that can still, be unpredictable. So investors are pretty cautious. So I think compared to India, India never got to that massive scale of investment that came into China from the US. And the question is, how much of it is being shifted? Some of it, to be honest, is shifted to Japan. And I spend 4 or 5 months a year in Japan now. And if you look at the landscape, the skyscrapers in Japan, in Toranomon and Tokyo Station around there, you'll see Citadel Security. You'll see like players who were big targeting China have now diversified. Some have split, even their offices towards Tokyo and Singapore. And I think from Singapore, we're going to see, more exposure to South Asia as well. So I think that China, there's a bit of a hangover, I would say, from the run up, but also the crackdown. And there's a nervousness, but also people don't want to miss out, right? I mean, if China is going to be at the forefront of robotics, AI we talked about, like people, can they play? Can they invest? Are they allowed to? Or, at least they need to learn. So I think what I'm trying to re-engineer my business for is learn what's happening in the lab. It doesn't mean you're going to come in and buy the lab, but you need to see what's happening. And there are a lot of tech tours, actually. It's quite interesting. People coming to Shenzhen, to Hangzhou, to Beijing, see these new factories, see these new technologies. So people are curious. It doesn't mean they're going to be investing heavily, but they know that stuff that's happening in China could have a major impact on other stuff they want to invest in. You need to know what's happening here. So that's, I think knowledge is precious right now about China, and it's not so accessible. There are not so many people like myself here still. I just met with another foreign friend who's been like the American guy 25 years. It's like, oh, there's nobody here. So I think it's an opportunity actually also for, I think visa apparently getting a bit better between China and India. I think because of this turn to the east that we talked about with the Asian Society India 2 weeks ago, U.S. policy towards India is a little unpredictable. So India is having a fresh look, at China in new ways. And I think it's all for each of us to look for ourselves and make our own opinions.
Right. So our next section is rapid fire. So we'll ask you some questions.
This was slow.
Try.
I think I speak very fast.
You have to be as fast as you can.
I talk too fast. Sorry.
So the first question is: if you were presently in your 20s, what are the 3 skills you would want to master?
Hair loss prevention? No. In my 20s, no. I think it's number one is just being flexible. So, and what does that actually mean? Maybe it's the second thing is being able to have 2 contrasting thoughts in your head at the same time that are basically shouldn't coexist, but that's how you understand the future. Like, you're trained to think a certain way and something else happens and you don't know, rather than resist that feeling, you think, well, that's interesting. So I guess that's a curiosity of intellect. But the world is complicated, both from a technology standpoint and now whether you want to call it geoeconomic or geopolitical. It's very complex. And I would even add intergenerational dynamics, right? As we talked about, like young people today, how they view the older generations. And so I would just say, rapid fire would be just incredible flexibility and try to reserve judgment on things. Just observe even challenging situations, remove yourself from it, try to observe as much as possible, and then adapt. Yeah. And how do you thrive these days is adaptability. Yeah.
So the second question is, now this is, I would hope you answer this in 1 or 2 words, okay, for each. So I'm gonna tell you a few names and you've got to tell me the first thing that comes to your head, okay? And just in a word or 2. So the first is Narendra Modi.
Strong man.
Okay. Donald Trump.
Thinks he's a strong man. Sorry.
Then Vladimir Putin.
Personally, I have Ukrainian friends, so I'm going to say not good for Russia's future or for us, but hopefully not there too long.
Okay. Then President Xi.
President Xi is same age almost as Putin, so I think he's going to be there for a while. I think he's a survivor, both of them.
Okay. Then London.
London, the city?
Yeah.
Global city in a country facing challenges, but ultimately an amazing city will prevail.
Yeah. Then Beijing.
Beijing, not as dynamic as Shanghai. Can do better.
Okay. And lastly, Singapore.
Singapore, well placed, educated, intelligent.
Okay. And the third question is, what career paths or domains you think would be in a very high demand in the coming future? Because what has happened is with AI coming, every industry is being disrupted. So what skills and careers you think will be in demand?
Podcasting. No. Yeah, again, it goes back to the flexibility, trying to make sense of confusion. There's a lot of confusion out there. So let's call it being a signal to noise, specialist, making sense of confusion, whether that's through podcasts, through investments. So I think it's going to be forming your own opinions from just overload of information and conflicting information. So what is that? Okay. I don't know, insight or I don't know what that word is, but it's some kind of like a helmsman. I wouldn't say great helmsman. That has other meanings, but able to a navigator. You want to be a navigator.
Right. Okay. The fourth question is 2 green flags and 2 red flags you look in a startup before investing.
Green flags would be, something that has a real impact. And a founder who can just take the hard knocks. Red flags is the same, really. I mean, a founder who is, both things are the opposite of the red flags. Somebody who's just sticking AI because it's sexy, or they want to be the CEO because they feel like it's, self-aggrandizing, but it's bloody hard.
Okay.
So I think there are, and one thing I'll say about Gen Z is like the embarrassment of riches of different directions to go. It's very confusing, right? It's very hard to, and I was with somebody last night. It was, many possibilities open to them, but how do you choose and how do you stick with it? Going back to endurance, like even if things move on and suddenly it doesn't seem so attractive, you just got to, you've got to commit. But it's the pivot disease, right? Everybody wants to pivot every 5 seconds. So
Yeah.
Right. So the fifth question is, what made you start Duncan's Dispatch?
Oh yeah, so I was with a friend at Meta in California, and she showed me these glasses when they were early stage. I just like the idea of wearing, having a point of view, literally, when you don't look at me, because I'm an aging middle-aged white guy. But what I see is, I travel a lot, and I find, to my earlier question about being a navigator, like when you see conflicting trends or even commonalities across markets and countries, that's where it gets interesting. If you start to sense something, and I think the idea of these, whether it be Meta or other glasses, I have these Chinese ones as well, which are these are like live translation glasses as well. I think I showed them in Mumbai.
Yeah,
I think glasses, smart tech or smart glasses, are with heads-up display or with audio inputs. I think it's a new frontier, including controlled by now rings or bands. So I just feel like it's a different angle. And one thing I'll just say, like, if you try to build a business in an existing mature technology area, say a podcasting or something, like, but maybe, every time there's a technology shift, like if you can be at the edge of some new thing that's happening, whether it's the glasses thing or some other device, you have an opportunity when there's like a new virgin sort of land out there. And I think that's maybe with the smart glasses. I mean, perversely, we've seen that Meta's like pulling back from, the heavy, VR kind of stuff. But I think this augmented reality, this blended sort of stuff, I think is interesting. Like, and also we're all on our phones too much. I don't know about you, but your neck is like, if you talk to orthopedic surgeons, they say like either people like have neck problems here or they're getting hit by cars because they're wearing these AirPods and they're not paying attention. So you need, look up, look around, and so tech that's going to help you, like be a tool for you, not a burden. We've all become, Australia today is just banned social media, right, for 16 to 18-year-olds. That's interesting. Like, what's going to happen from a regulatory standpoint, from a tech standpoint? I like the idea of like these wearables that are, anyway, and quick. You've got to cut through. I'm talking too long. You got like 10 seconds these days, 5 to make an impression. And so video is important. We've seen that. Video has completely disrupted, right, media.
So our next question is, how does your friends describe you how does anyone describe Duncan in 3 words?
Loquacious. Let's see. Not easy to settle down. But hopefully I'm there for them when they need it, if they can get through to me. Yeah.
And the last question, what has been a career defining moment for you?
I think it was leaving the world of banking and leaving comfortable Hong Kong. I was pre-97 Hong Kong and heading north here to the great unknown, to be an entrepreneur or consultant entrepreneur, but still in China. So I think actually going against your fears, and I think the great advantage for me was I didn't speak a word of Chinese. I was completely ignorant about what I was doing. So ignorance can be, I wouldn't recommend that today, but I think sometimes, if you know too much, you're going to analyze things to death. Sometimes you just got to go with your gut feel.
Yeah, sure. So I think this was a podcast, and we really enjoyed it with you.
Thank you, guys.
It was a really different perspective from what we usually hear.
I'm happy to hear that.
And it was grounded in reality, since you've been the first person to experience all of this. So it was very unique.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to coming back. So we're opening our office in Singapore in a few weeks, and then it's an easy hop and a jump. Looking forward to spending more time in Mumbai. So
great.
You're just outside Mumbai, are you? Where's the university actually?
It's in Mumbai.
Yeah, it's close to the airport.
Yeah. It's near the airport. The new one or the current one?
No, the international airport.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, let me come check out the campus. Honored Professor Desai. Yeah.
So I think it's a wrap. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Clapperboard. Great. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great. I enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
And see you guys in Mumbai soon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Best wishes for the happen year. Okay. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.